My name is Ian Campbell. I'm Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. I am the author of the book Knowledge and the Ends of Empire, Kazakh Intermediaries and Russian Rule on the Steppe, 1731 to 1917, published with Cornell University Press in 2017. And to be coming out in Russian translation with Academic Studies Press next year. So that's occupying some of my time now, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. As I learned more about Kazakh culture, it began to seem not just like an accident. It began also to seem like there might be some really interesting things here to talk about. And my interest, I also had started with an interest in imperial geography. So the way that Russian travelers, that Russian explorers thought about their empire. And then as I began to learn about some famous Kazakhs in history, so figures like Chokan Valikhanov, who had collaborated, who had worked with the Imperial Russian Geographic Society, who had been part of some expeditions. As I learned about the great poet Abay Kunanbayev, and learned about his kind of friendship with exiles involved, with Russian exiles who were involved with the local branches of the Russian Geographic Society in Kazakhstan, it struck me that this might be an interesting way to bring these interests together, to bring together, on one hand, an interest that I'd had in empire, particularly an interest that I had had in the way that people who weren't part of the dominant national group responded to empire, participated in it, to bring that interest together, which I had developed in several classes during my training, with that other interest in geography and exploration in ideologies of empire, the way that what empires knew about themselves and the way they thought about. It begins from an idea that bureaucrats and administrators in the Russian Empire didn't know very much about the land and people that they were trying to govern. And this is the case really all over the empire, that power gets quite weak pretty fast when you leave a major administrative center. And particularly when we start talking about, well, not only the steppe, but say the North Caucasus or Central Asia proper, Turkestan, when there are these differences, not only when there's not just kind of this general problem of governance, but also people who live in very different ways, people who nomadize instead of doing settled agriculture, people who are not Christian, people who live in a radically different kind of environment. There aren't forests everywhere anymore. The climate is very different. Russian administrators, not only do they, tsarist administrators rather, they're not just ethnically Russian, they have not only this kind of general problem that the Russian Empire is undergoverned, doesn't know as much as it does, but they also kind of lack a conceptual framework even to begin to apprehend it. They don't really necessarily understand what you can and can't do on grasslands. They have a rather imperfect understanding of how Islam works in people's kind of daily lives. So this general problem of governance becomes a particularly difficult one on the Kazakh steppe. And it seems to me, I discovered in my research, that this isn't a problem just that we, looking back as historians, can see now. Russian administrators were aware of this even at the time. They knew that they didn't know enough to do the kinds of things that they wanted to do. And so they depended on local people who were not Russian, people who actually were from the local community, who knew the environment, to kind of help them out with this thing. And over time, these roles meant quite different things, particularly in roughly the first century of imperial involvement on the steppe. And I don't talk about this a great deal in my book. This kind of first century or so of kind of Russian indirect rule, there's a lot of dependence on guides. There's a lot of dependence on translators, people who can be kind of go-betweens to help people who don't even really quite know where to go. But the era that I'm most interested in my book is after roughly the 1840s, when the Russians are trying to transform the steppe in a more thoroughgoing way, when they're trying to rule it, when they're trying to really govern it instead of just sort of manage it, using direct rule. And this, I mean, of course, there are still translators. Of course, translators are still important. But what this also means is that the kind of governmental roles change. There starts to be this kind of network of schools. You get more Kazakhs who are educated in what are called the Russo-Kazakh schools. So this kind of network of colonial schools, or in cadet corps, that's Valikhanov's experience, for example, that he's kind of meant that this would, provide a kind of a general education that would also provide people with preparation to enter military service, which is the kind of great form of social advancement for people in the Russian Empire at this time. So you start to get more Russian educated Kazakhs, you start to get more direct rule on the steppe. And this creates a kind of a new circumstance in which you get this not too large cohort of Kazakhs who actually seek to engage with imperial institutions, seek to publish in kind of Russian language publications. And this period lasts for a few decades. This period where Kazakhs have this particular kind of influence. The Russian Empire, in attempting to reform the steppe the steppe region in the 1860s, they create this study commission, the Steppe Commission. They send some experts out, they have them do field work, they have them research in archives and things like that, and they try to figure out really what is this place like, what ought we to do? And there's this kind of positivist idea, this kind of idea that if we just learn all the facts, we can write the right kind of governing statute for this place. And they do this work for a couple of years. They are interviewing also Kazakhs on the steppe. They are reading kind of everything they can, both by Russian authors and by people like Valikhanov, for example. And they come to the conclusion in the end that actually they don't know enough to do any of this, which is why the governing statute they write is called the provisional statute. It's an experiment. It's meant to last only for 2 years. And after that, the idea is, well, we can kind of see what worked and what didn't, and we can push back and we can kind of change what we need to. This actually lasts 25 years before they reform it again, before they create the steppe statute. And what this means is that there is this particular window where the Russians are trying to govern the steppe directly and creating new institutions to produce knowledge. They're actually still deeply dependent knowledge wherever they can get it, there's a lot of kind of space for low-level people to kind of make arguments about how this could be, about how the steppe ought to be in the future. And this, to me, is really the kind of meat of the book. And what I want to show in these sections of the book is that people like Valikhanov, whom I've already mentioned, or I do a whole chapter on an ethnographer and educator, the director of Kazakh schools in one part of the steppe, a guy named Ibrai Altansarin, or Kazakhs who contribute to these various publications about the steppe, these kind of provincial newspapers and things like that. But what I want to show is that they actually had some amount of freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, in terms in which they chose to work with imperial institutions, and that they actually were able sometimes to actually kind of to change the outcomes of governance on the steppes. So Altansarin's vision of schools is in a way quite different from what the vision at the Ministry of Education in St. Petersburg, or the vision of somebody like, and he's a close correspondent of some famous kind of Orientalists, like Nikolai Ominsky, this kind of famous missionary, or Vasily Grigoriev. He corresponds with them. His view of Islam, of culture, of how you might, of the direction in which maybe we might want to transform Kazakh society, is actually quite different from theirs. But in this kind of favorable administrative conjunction, he's able to argue successfully to kind of local administrators that, look, I actually know this better. As a steppe man, he uses the word stepnyak in Russian. As a steppe man, I know this. I know, for example, that we can't set up schools that are teaching people only to sow grain, to do agriculture. That's not going to work. We need to kind of create schools that deal with both the steppe environment as I know it, and we need to deal with the kind of pre-existing skills that Kazakhs already have. So he's still assuming that, yes, the steppe has to develop, it has to transform, and some environments, and some kind of arguments about how empires work assume that, well, that's the most important thing. He assumes that it has to transform as well. But no, I don't think that's right. He's mobilizing totally different arguments, and the future that he envisions is, as a practical matter, very, very different from the one that somebody like Ilminsky envisioned, or Grigoriev envisions for the steppe, or people who want to introduce sedentary agriculture to the steppe. It's a very different kind of future that he envisions. And so that window lasts roughly, and that kind of window of opportunity lasts roughly until, I would say, the mid-1890s. And the thing that changes it is the resettlement of peasants from the European part of the empire into the steppe region. This already is a difficult thing for kind of Kazakh intellectuals or Russian-educated Kazakhs to deal with, because it involves taking a lot of land out of Kazakh hands and putting it into other people's hands. Prior to the 1890s, there's a lot of hesitation, even among Russian administrators, about resettling peasants, right? Uncontrolled peasant movement seems potentially threatening to them, and local administrators don't want to have to deal with peasants. But as there's this kind of spontaneous movement to the steppe in the early 1890s, during the famine of 1891, as the Siberian Railroad is being built, resettlement starts getting seen in some circles as a useful and a good thing. The Expedition for Research of the Steppe Regions, led by a statistician named Fyodor Andreevich Sherbina, who's an interesting guy in and of himself. He's a former political exile who winds up being the best person available for the job. And Kazakhs actually participate in this expedition. Most famously, a later autonomous politician named Alikhan Bukhayanov participates in this and writes up some of the materials. So the point is that these expeditions, and Sherbina's is only the first one to start researching the steppe regions, the steppe oblasts. There's an idea that they're trying to establish norms of land use, because the new law that governs the steppe after 1891 says that, well, it clarifies that the pastures that Kazakh nomads use are kind of granted them on terms of long-term rental for use, and that any lands which are discovered to be surplus can be taken back from them to satisfy various state needs. And in the 1890s, what state needs comes to mean is almost exclusively land to allot to peasant settlers. So what these statistical expeditions are trying to do is to figure out, to borrow a literary phrase, how much land does a man need, right? They try to figure out what is a typical Kazakh household. How much livestock does it have? What is the quality of land they live on, such that they can figure out okay, a household with 15 horses might need so many acres of good pasture or so many more acres of bad pasture to survive. And this is all done extremely abstractly as well. They take all of the kind of livestock that a family might own, and they convert it to horse units. Everything is like equal to a horse. So a camel, for example, is 2 horses. A goat is a tenth of a horse. It's all extremely abstract, and they wind up talking about the loshadnost of a different region. It's horseness, right? How many horses does it hold? But the idea is that they try to figure out how much pasture land roughly does a typical Kazakh household need. And then the idea is that you can take that land norm of a typical household, you can multiply it by the number of households in a district on the steppe. And then you get the total land need for Kazakhs in a given district. You then simply subtract that amount that Kazakhs need from the total land area of the district to figure out how much land is actually needed, how much land is left for settlers, QED, right? Simple, it's mathematically very simple. And so what the point, and Sherbina's expedition takes these norms quite conservatively, in part, I think, because of Bukhanov's influence, in part because of a general sense, for having actually kind of discovered that not all of the land they're looking at could ever be used for agriculture, that pastoral nomadism has a role to play in the steppe. So Sherbina's norms are relatively conservative. Later norms revise them down, revise the amount of land allotted to Kazakhs down quite substantially in order to accommodate more settlers, basically. Really, at this point, this kind of local knowledge that Kazakhs have been deploying in the past to try to influence policy, it can no longer really quite find a way in to influence arguments, because as long as tsarist administrators think that there are limits to what they know and think that they are very interested in knowledge that is qualitative and subjective and based on people's kind of experience or sense of things that you could maybe only get as a local person, they still at least sometimes have a way to participate in these debates. But once it becomes hyper quantitative, once the way of knowing the steppe is, just pages and pages of data tables and statistical formulae, then there's a kind of subjective experience no longer has a way in. And the numbers look objectively right. There's no longer any kind of basis for contesting this on the basis that you don't know this as well as they do. People in the Tsarist Resettlement Administration think, no, actually, we know this all just about perfectly. And so what this kind of does, and to me, this is a story that's really familiar from many other parts of the Russian Empire as well. This takes figures who really, who had kind of a liberal cast of thought, who really kind of wanted to work with the Tsarist government to develop things in their own way. It kind of kicks them out against their will, and it kind of fuels this autonomous movement. It fuels this parting of ways. But there might have been a way to do this differently. There might have been a way to continue to work with kind of local figures, to continue to value the kinds of knowledge, the kind of experience that they brought in, that resulted in kind of a more fruitful future for the steppe as part of the empire. But in a way, it's not just Kazakh autonomists running away from the empire. It's also imperial institutions kicking them out.